hospitalized at Elgin Hospital. My parents would visit her at Christmas. Often they would leave us in the car. Once in a while we were allowed to go in. But Elgin was a mental hospital, and it was a scary place. Dim and dark, the hallways were shadowed, and behind every door it seemed that you would hear these sounds, moans and shrieks, murmurings. It was a scary place. Her husband, he had institutionalized her. Something about abusing alcohol, which was funny since he was a drunk. When we pick up this Bible story where Jesus, on his first public engagement, is in the synagogue and he's been teaching, and all of a sudden there's this person there who's shouting at him, maybe even taunting him. Nah, I know who you are. And then Jesus starts shouting back. They're having this engagement there in the middle of worship, shouting at one another, and the man's down and rolling on the floor. Wonder if when we look in on that story, if we almost think like we're visiting some lunatic asylum. As we begin today, let's admit to our modern prejudice that when the text says that the man had an unclean spirit, we're not quite sure what that means. And some translators even go so far as to name him having an evil spirit, which makes it even heavier on us. We, in our own time, we have used psychological language and medicine, and we often relabel the experiences that are going on in Scripture. There's that time when the boy is thrown down and he seems to have a seizure, and looking at it from our perspective, we've come to assume that he has epilepsy. And the class that's meeting on Sunday mornings around politics have been looking at King Saul, and we've named some of what Saul's going through as he's losing his grip. He's paranoid, he's narcissistic, he's suffering a kind of depression. We look at that and we put these labels on that, and maybe, as one biblical scholar has noted, the biblical writers didn't have our language, so they look at these experiences and they call it an unclean spirit or an evil spirit. We, in our time, we would put a different label on it. We look at the symptoms. There in that synagogue, the two of them in a shouting match, Jesus and this man. They're shouting at one another, and Jesus says, "Shut up." Let's admit that we're not sure how we understand all this. That's where we start. And yet, what if the language unclean spirit, what if that language is just trying to describe how it is that something moves into one's life and begins to exert control? What if that's just language to describe what happens in life when something other than our own logical consciousness is dictating how we're going to behave? Then we might even think about addiction as being a kind of, to use biblical language, an unclean spirit that takes over. We're in the midst of an opioid addiction epidemic. Could it be that we could talk about how the cravings take over a person's life and dictate behaviors so that families are destroyed, jobs are lost, life threatened? We might even think about some of our compulsions that aren't really healthy for us. If we decide, or we don't decide, we just discover that when we're feeling blue or stressed, we eat a lot. Or even though the credit card bill is already filled up, the pressure's on, and we decide we're going shopping. Even though when we open the closet, there's plenty of clothes and there's stacks of boxes of shoes we haven't even worn yet. There I was, watching an early episode of Crown on Netflix. Have you watched that? And I started yelling at the TV. Actually, screaming at it. It was one of those episodes where the young queen was being manipulated by the old-time staff, who said to her, the tradition, she had to do things a certain way because of traditions. And it was getting in the way of her marriage. In fact, it was putting pressure on the marriage. And I was screaming at the television. Now, friends, it wasn't until this week, when I was working on this passage, that it dawned on me that I had been taken over by the spirit of anger. I wasn't angry for the young queen. I was angry for the young Paul Stunkel, who was blocked on many occasions by people who said, we have a tradition. You don't do church that way. And staff members who had more longevity, who said, oh, you can't do that. I was angry. I was taken over by a spirit of anger. And I screamed at the TV, even got in an argument with Karen. And it was not until this week that I figured out what was going on. There are forces, are there not, that come into us, take over control control. And we don't even know why we're doing what we're doing. An unclean spirit. Now, the good news is that Jesus has authority over unclean spirits. That's good news. That Jesus has influence to speak into our lives in those murky places. That he is able by his presence to bring clarity and to invite us to live in that clarity. It's interesting if you look at that story that we don't have a hint about what Jesus' lesson plan in teaching was that day. We don't know his lecture notes. There's none of that. What the writer wants us to see in bold clarity is that Jesus Christ has authority and is in this conflict with anything that would distort us from a right relationship with God. And even though the Spirit is muzzled, the Spirit still resists him. The other odd note, just so we're clear, the Spirit knows who Jesus is. But having knowledge does not guarantee a relationship. Knowledge must lead to some sort of response action on our part. So here's the question. What's Jesus want with us? What does Jesus want with people like us who get caught up in compulsions, get hooked on our favorite addictions, whether it be nicotine, caffeine, or something worse? What we do know is that what we're never going to hear out of Jesus' mouth is, oh, I don't really have anything to say to you. He's always going to have something to say. For Jesus is there to speak to the forces that would destroy us. He speaks God's love into our lives, into the poisons of our own making. Jesus shouts to us that we are loved even when, like in Tolkien's Golem, we whisper to ourselves these false words. That I'm not good enough, I'm not attractive enough, not slim enough, not smart enough, not enough. The love of God threatens to muzzle any word, any unclean voice that threatens to make us understand ourselves as unloved. These voices threaten to isolate us and demean us, to make us feel forgotten and alone. Jesus shows us that God accepts us and loves us and pulls us into communities of forgiven sinners, so that all of us, each of us, remembers that we are a child of God. What Jesus wants of us and for us is to speak love into our lives so that we understand ourselves to be worthy of God's gracious acceptance. And if that's true, if Jesus is shouting love into our lives, what's left for us to do? For some of us, maybe if we're not yet convinced, maybe what we need is to ask Jesus to have more Jesus in our lives. To have open house time with Jesus. And open ourselves up to have Jesus be present to clean out the poisons of untruths and distortion, so that God's abiding peace could abide in us. Now, if we're already convinced that we are one of God's beloved, then maybe we'll shout about it and live more freely in God's grace. We might even then sing louder, pray thankfully more often, get on Facebook and tell our friends the difference Jesus has made in our lives. Tell the neighbors that we're loved and accepted. Sometimes the greatest enemy we have is our own self-doubt. We doubt that God could love us, and that is the unclean spirit that we need God in Jesus Christ to silence. Let's pray. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, be close enough to each of us to silence those voices that would call into question your love for us. Restore us, please. And if we have listened to those unclean voices, we ask that you muzzle them now, that we might hear you.